Thank you for taking the time to watch this episode of Life Support. If you enjoy the content, we would ask that you like it, hit subscribe, and share it with your friends. It's so good to have you on Life Support. What we do on this program is we tell stories, and we love to highlight how God is working in different ways and in different lives, and that redemption comes through Christ. And we've got a man here today that tells a great story of what he's seen and how God is working in incredibly different context than what we're used to. His name is Andrew Johnson. He's a criminal justice professor at Metro State, and he's also a filmmaker. And Andrew, I'm so glad you're back because you were telling us about your experience in a foreign prison, a couple of them, where you actually spent time inside. You saw the church operate. Let's just visit that for a moment because I want to get people caught up. But you saw prisoners who were pretty much on their own organizing a prison, and God worked it so that the church was allowed to be and allowed to thrive and even respected, which I think is an amazing story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in almost every prison in Brazil, there is an inmate-led, independent, autonomous prison church that is operating behind bars, not affiliated with any prison ministry. And these are self-sustaining. They have their own offerings and resources and names and organizational model and things like that. It's happening through the whole country.
Wow. And so you spent time inside. You actually went and lived with them and saw it all happen. That had to take some courage. I don't know if I would want to walk inside a place like that.
It did,
yeah.
But I was treated very well. So I remember I was supposed to show up at this prison at noon, and I was sitting in sort of the town square, and I couldn't get off the bench. I had a lot of doubt thinking, like, what have I gotten myself into? But once I sort of got in there, I was really treated well. And there's also, in Brazil, sort of a prison code that we treat visitors with respect. And so I walked into some of the worst prisons in the state, and I walked in with pastors sometimes. And I remember this one guy, he brought in like his 15-year-old daughter, and there was 400 inmates, and there wasn't a guard or an officer anywhere. And as we walked down, it was packed. The hallway sort of, a path just opened in front of us. And I saw a guy put their shirts on. They stopped smoking. I remember the one that was given a tattoo gun in the corridor, that buzzing stopped. All the radios went down because the visitor's coming. In this case, a pastor's coming. And so they treat visitors with a lot of respect. And so I learned that firsthand. And by the end of it, I sort of grew to trust in that code. And I didn't feel like anything would happen to me. I mean, the thought did cross my mind, like I'd make a great hostage. If they want to get a hostage and get some attention, get me.
Yeah.
But as I spent more time there, I realized that wasn't going to happen.
Mm-hmm. And, it also amazes me that the gangs who ran these prisons saw the church as a positive thing, or at least something to respect. And so they stayed away. Mm-hmm. And that in itself shows the power of God in a very dark situation.
Yes, even people who are actively doing bad and sort of would admit that, knew that these people are attached to something else. And so it's in my own best interest not to mess with that.
Yeah. Now you're saying that similar to what prisoners experience here in the States, where they get out and their lives change and they've got to adjust to this brand new existence. They've been regimented in a prison, now they're out. The guys that you ran into there also had that same issue, but maybe even more intensely, because the church in the prison was like 24/7. It's like you didn't do the service and then, in Minnesota go watch the Vikings and then forget everything the pastor just said. Not that they would ever do that. But these guys were 24/7 at church, in church, with church, and all of a sudden they get out and they realize that these people have other lives, and, how did they adjust to that?
It's difficult. And so there's even been some places look for prisoner churches. Like inmates themselves will make their own church on the outside because they want to replicate that experience, but that being really connected to something and being part of this intentional community. And I think that's a bridge that people have to get over when they get out. And if you think about it, in prison, your food's taken care of, your daily life is already structured, you don't have to worry about rent, or it becomes very simple. and
Yeah.
the rest of life is very complicated.
Right.
And so it's difficult to replicate that prison church experience. On the other hand, I think churches outside of prison can say, wow, here's a place where churches are growing, where they're gaining members, and they're thriving, they're flourishing in a way, in a very unlikely, difficult place. What are some things that we on the outside could learn from these churches on the inside and maybe implement those into our...
Yeah, there's a lot to be learned by that. We're so individualistic, not only when we're attending churches, trying to create community and relationships, but churches being with other churches is almost non-existent. You go to that church, I go to that church, might trade churches once in a while or something like that. But the thought of that kind of intentional community seems to be far away in the United States. And so it really is good to look at that and say, sure, they were in prison, they had a different kind of lifestyle, but something happened there that was life-changing because of that situation they were in. And I'm assuming you saw it firsthand that a lot of that was because they were held accountable, there was community, and they all worked together, right?
And I think when you're trying to become a different person, it gives you a sort of a set of practices to become someone different. You didn't just change the thoughts in your head. You didn't just say, I'm a different person. You actually are a different person. You're a different person because you're going to church every day. Seems like sort of a legalistic thing, but it's a choice. And by doing that, like, that's the person I'm becoming. I'm becoming someone who doesn't smoke, who doesn't use drugs, who doesn't talk about women in a certain way. And these are all big topics inside of prison. And you're around people who are doing that. And so as a group, they sort of lift each other up. And I saw it happen.
Yeah.
And it becomes surprisingly, the churches are very orthodox Christian churches. There's not like a prison theology. And
they protect their real theology.
Yes, yeah.
It's interesting. So you had these really two worlds going on in the prisons. You had the gang who you said, operated, there really weren't any rules. And then you had the church, they coexisted. What influence did you see the church have on the gang, just by being the church?
I think they provided an outlet and gave some hope. Like if you're in the gang and you're stuck in the gang and you don't see any way to get out of there, I mean, the church is sort of does two things. One, it is in the back of your mind, well, this is an exit if I have to. And then also the way the church treated the gang members. They treated them as if they had value and if they were people worthy of love and worthy of redemption. And so I think that sort of model, because one thing the church didn't do is it never threatened the authority of the gang in prison. And so the church never said, these gangs shouldn't have this much authority in prison or even the neighborhoods. So they didn't sort of do a political movement and so they didn't undermine the gang's ultimate authority, but they were sort of a parallel group alongside that treated them different and that offered them a way out and offered them hope and salvation when sort of what the gang offered ran to an end.
They were focused on the individuals that they were doing life with. It's interesting. We have this very politically charged atmosphere. You can almost take an evangelical church and you're going to think 90% are probably on this side of the aisle and go to another place and they're on that side of the aisle. But when you look at the early church, they weren't really trying to change the governmental structure. Like, I don't see anything in Scripture like the people living in Rome weren't trying to overthrow the Roman government. They weren't trying to bring, to make this kind of utopia. What they were doing was shining a light for Christ and caring for Roman citizens in a way that no one else did. There was a huge plague in Rome, and hundreds of thousands of people died, and it was the Christians who stepped forward and took care of other Romans to their own, to their own risk. And so you're describing that same kind of thing going on, and that's a really good lesson for us as Christians in America, because we tend to really be divided out, and we tend to kind of decide who we really want to minister and not, and who needs it and who doesn't. It seems like there, everybody was on equal footing. And that's a powerful lesson for us.
And And I saw it in two ways. One is the people visiting the prison were almost exclusively Christians, and to minister or to bring medical supplies or things like that. And then also the church would take up offerings and and either buy basic supplies for people who had nothing, toothbrushes, sandals, things like that. Or in certain cases, I remember there's a lot of pride because someone was there from a different state and they took an offering and bought his mother a bus ticket to come to visit him.
Wow.
And so,
yeah, that's how the church functioned. Now, you also had an experience in Mississippi, right?
Yeah, currently I'm working on a project in Mississippi, and that's with Pepperdine University and their Center for Faith and the Common Good. And we're doing hopefully a 5-year project on not only faith inside of prison, but also the transformation of a prison in the United States. And so I've been there for the last 2 years, visiting almost monthly, and we'll hope to keep doing that for the next few years. And we'll come up with a film or sort of television series product and a book and articles based on what we're seeing there.
And from what we were talking before we started recording, that not all prisons are created equal. Mm-hmm. And it sounds like the one you're dealing with has gone through a lot of reform, and it sounds like a really interesting study.
Yes, so I arrived there to look specifically at religion inside of prison. But this prison, Mississippi State Penitentiary, was considered one of the worst in the country, and it had recently gone through a horrible series of riots and violence, and the prison has just fallen into disrepair. And this was in 2019. A lot of attention came to it, and one thing to remember: this prison is the size of Manhattan. It's It's on a huge chunk of land, mm-hmm. And the state brought in new leadership and say for the last 120 years, no one's been able to sort of transform this place. And so I had my doubts, and as I've been there, it's been a remarkable transformation. And part of that is through the Bible college. They have a 4-year seminary where inmates, most who have life sentences, will go through this 4-year project or 4-year program. It's the same curriculum used in the New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary. And they graduate and they're sent out to different parts of the prison as ministers and peer counselors and pastors. And another part of it has been the leadership and has been sort of a new vision that has come through, and it's a dramatic change is happening.
It seems that everywhere God works in people, then the surroundings kind of get automatically transformed as well because there's so much power there. I remember my wife and I went to a prison here in Minnesota to talk with the inmates and about our experience with violent crime as a victim, and we were going to talk to them about victim reconciliation and so forth. And they had some lifers, for murder and things like that. And they would come up with and talk with us and say things like, "Man, I met Christ and I've never been more alive. Mm-hmm. I met Christ and I have a purpose for living now. I'm going to be here the rest of my life, but every morning I get up and I know what I'm supposed to be doing." Mm-hmm. And sometimes when you haven't had that experience with people who have been incarcerated, you just assume that you just kind of throw them away and there's no hope for them really. But wow, there is hope for them. Mm-hmm. And God is working in their lives. Do you ever wonder how we can get Christians to really understand the mission field that you're dealing with people who are behind bars and are going to be for a long time?
Yeah, so that's accurately describes what I'm going through by visiting Mississippi. On one hand, you would think, and when you walk in there, sometimes you think, what if the rest of my life was going to happen in this place, with this food, these surroundings.
What is the food like, by the way?
It's not great. It's sometimes I'm there during lunch, and it's like one day I remember this vividly because I said, "What is that?" It was like a soy pod burger type thing. And I think the food is improving a little bit, but as people talk to me, they say we just try to scarf it down and not just try to get it.
What we're eating.
Just try to get it into the stomach.
Right.
And I was talking with a guy one time, and he's talking about how important it is to be grateful in prison. And we're looking at the food, and he says, when I pray, I say, "Lord, thank you for this food, this isn't the food I would have chosen, but this is the food you gave me, and I'm grateful for it.
Right.
And I thought, wow.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
That's pretty, yeah. And I find myself, I'm encouraged and by spending time among these guys who are in the most depressing situation possible. Mm-hmm. Like in Mississippi, life is life. You're not getting out. And so you meet people who have been there for 25 and 30 years, and they're living life with dignity and with purpose and with meaning. And it's remarkable to see. Mm-hmm. And so outside of prison in this country, we're dealing with this malaise and this, deaths of despair are rising. And there's this sort of crisis of purpose in the country. Why are we, what are we doing here? Yet in prison, and this isn't for everybody, but you meet all sorts of people who have been radically transformed through Christ and are living for God and who are alive with almost no material possessions at all. And we're going there in a couple weeks to film 3 guys who are all serving life, and 2 are life in prison, 1 is 15 years. But they're all 3 of them are willingly going to the worst prison in Mississippi. It's sort of people dealing with mental problems, and it's in disrepair. The inmates themselves call it the zoo because it's so. And so these guys are going there. They're being willingly transferred to sort of plant a church.
Wow.
And to serve. And so they are serving life in prison, but they're energized and they're excited about going because they have this mission to go on.
They're planting churches in prisons.
Yes, they're planting churches in prison. And they say, we're going to see what's going on there, but we're going to serve in whatever way possible. And I'm thinking to myself, they got a pretty good gig going at where they are because they've sort of risen up over time, and they're giving that up to go to sort of the worst place and with smiles on their faces. And that's a remarkable thing.
Yeah, God can penetrate any situation and any darkness to change lives. So, of all the people that you've met through all of these travails you just talked about, all these journeys, and is there one person that kind of just stands out to you as like, yeah, this story is kind of the one I think about a lot that motivates me? Is there a person that kind of just is in the back of your mind going like, yeah, this is why I'm doing this?
There are a few, and I spend a lot of time on death row. And so I would say the 2 people that really have stuck in mind, one is the superintendent of the prison, Mark McClure. I respect him, and what I've seen him do is dramatic. And one of the things that he's done is to change death row. So death row used to be 23 hours in their cells a day and 1 hour out. And when they would go, they would have an hour in a cage, basically. And he took over and he said, we're going to start treating these guys better because we're going to sort of let them out and there's a small death row church. And the pastor of death row is another person that's really stuck in my mind. And he wakes up at 2 o'clock every morning and reads his Bible for 40 minutes and prays for half an hour, does 40 minutes of study, and then does a series of calisthenics to sort of, that's his daily routine. And he spends a lot of time in prayer. And he leads this small church of death row inmates. And he takes it very seriously. I've sat in a number of their Bible studies and services, and his Bible is marked up from front to back. He can recite it from both ways. And so both of these guys are changing lives around them. Yet when it comes down to it, the superintendent has to, when the execution order comes, has to participate in this guy's execution.
Yeah.
And there's no getting around that.
Right.
And so when I think of things don't work out, the doors don't fly open to prison and all of the captives are set free. Like, we're still on earth and they're still in these messy systems and it's not totally clear. And I think their relationship to me shows kind of how difficult this is. Is that you have the superintendent who I believe God is using for tremendous good, and you have this pastor of the death row church who is also God is using, and but when their paths will meet. Yeah. And that's what it is.
Yeah, and that's what it is. And we sometimes wonder if God can really use us in our sphere of influence. I talk to a lot of men, especially who say, like, I want to get into full-time ministry. Well, what do you do now? Well, you're already in ministry. Like, go there, because you can have a lot more impact there. And this just shows that so clearly that no matter where you are, who you are right now, you're listening, God has a plan for you. You can be used by God. And I'm guessing that the death row pastor that you're talking about is totally surrendered to the will of God. I mean, that's what he lives for, right?
Yes, and he says, he says everyone's got a death sentence. We're all going to die.
Yeah.
And so ours is a little, it's a little more, we have a date and a time and things like that, so it brings things into clear focus. But, we're all in this world going somewhere. And so this idea of what is really important and is really, really dramatic. And in a lot of these cases too, I ask myself, well, could God be enough? If I lost my family, my friends, my house, and my freedom and everything, is God enough in that? And I hopefully I'll never have to answer that question because I don't want to go through all that.
Yeah.
But I'm seeing that it is.
But in a way, that's a gift for them.
Yeah.
That God's given them because they're able to figure that out.
Mm-hmm. And so I've spoke to a number of people who say the next revival is going to come from our prisons. And that there's something that's happening in our prisons that's going to spill out from the prison walls into the country. And I don't know if that's going to happen or not, but I certainly see glimpses of God working in prisons that I have a hard time seeing other places.
Yeah. And the technology now is making content like this and other Christian content now available to, I think this show is seen in about 1,100 prisons across the country or something, because there's an app now that Christian organizations can get on. Prisoners can't get online like we get online, but they get a tablet and they can browse through content. So technology is going to help the gospel too to infiltrate prisons. And I would imagine that you could very well see a revival there. That would be very, very exciting.
Yeah, I think God is equipping people inside of prisons to minister to each other, and I think that has the potential to flow then out of our prisons into. Yeah.
Well, you have a great story. Where can the public see your work?
They can see we did a 12-minute film on one of the worship services in Mississippi State Penitentiary on the website for Pepperdine's Center for Faith in the Common Good. But if you type in "Flourishing Captives, Pepperdine University," you'll find the video.
Flourishing Captives.
Flourishing
Pepperdine
Captives.
University.
Yep. You type that in, you'll find what you need to find.
Okay. Well, I'm glad you're doing what you're doing. Keep up the good work, and thanks for sharing it with us. I really appreciate it.